Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm the director of the centre and an author, and today I'm joined all the way from the other side of the world by AJ Lancaster. AJ, tell us where I am talking to you. Where are you sitting at the moment?
I am currently sitting in my office in the city of Palmerston North, which is in the North Island of New Zealand.
Yeah, so it's literally across the world we're talking. Now, AJ...
I think it's about as far away from the UK as you can get, roughly.
But fantasy is bringing us together. So AJ came across my radar because I came across her fantastic series, which we'll come to, the Stariel series, which we'll come to in a moment. But you can't escape, AJ. Anybody who comes out of New Zealand and meets a fantasy fan is always going to be asked about what their feelings are about Middle-earth basically becoming synonymous with New Zealand. I'm basically expecting you to be a cousin of Peter Jackson or something. Is this true?
Oh yes, obviously we're all related to him.
Yeah.
As just like every New Zealander owns 10 sheep. That's and we're all hobbits. It is one of those strange things that gets associated with New Zealand when you're overseas or you're talking to someone from overseas. Is Lord of the Rings, sheep, rugby, one of those three, depending on your audience. So for me, I'm gonna commit sacrilege and say I actually like the movies better than the books.
Oh no! In the broadcast.
You can take that out later. I think I honor what Tolkien did for the genre, but it's not my preferred style. I guess I like a slightly more modern, slightly faster paced thing, whilst admiring all the work he did inventing languages and all the kind of myth kind of level. In terms of New Zealand, it's a very strange thing because New Zealand is really beautiful, and I feel like the movies really captured that, and a lot of it does look like that. But Lord of the Rings, places like the Shire, the land that Tolkien was imagining is clearly more England.
Yeah, it is an odd disconnect, isn't it? Because I think I live somewhere much more like the Shire than the Hobbiton that was created, which felt...
Have you ever been to New Zealand?
No, I'd love to come.
You should come. The Hobbiton it is very charming, I have to say.
I suppose what I was thinking about was more... It's quite... Obviously, it's a film set, so it's relatively small, and it doesn't have the network of villages that the Shire actually is, and the pubs and the sense of rival communities and Buckland and all the rest of it, which is absolutely necessary for a film set. Whereas places I live near are very like that. And I think you don't have to worry about being identified as a hobbit because, there's plenty of us over here too. Anyway, so I was wondering if you felt that the use of the Middle-earth landscapes as being synonymous with New Zealand kind of get in the way of your own fantasy creative your imagination, because you feel it's already been used in that way.
No, not really, because although the sort of movie has that sort of very iconic landscapes, it doesn't feel like New Zealand, if that makes sense.
Right. Now that would be an interesting challenge. If I came and visited it, would I be walking around with entirely the wrong lens? I think I might be. I reckon a lot of these package tours might.
Well, you would see particular bits, or like you say, like you would go to the, the tourist set at Matamata, which is Hobbiton. That's where they built it. But something you said about the, like New Zealand doesn't have the little connections of villages to other villages. It's that kind of weight of human history. Obviously New Zealand does have its own history, and we have our own Indigenous people. But in terms of the length of human occupation, like in England, there are pubs that are 500 years old, and it's not that unusual. But that is not the case in New Zealand. We don't have, it's debatable when Māori first came to New Zealand, but say roughly 1,000 years ago or so. But then if you go back much further than that, 2,000 years ago, there were people in England building things, but there were birds here. And I'm getting off point. But in terms of like the flora and fauna, that's not so much in the movies, I guess, because it wouldn't fit with the kind of Tolkien-esque, all our kind of bird life and like a little bit of the bush, but the spots they chose particularly to more represent kind of very English and European flora and trees and things. So when I kind of watch the movies, although I can pick out particular landscapes, it doesn't kind of evoke kind of that feeling of walking through the New Zealand bush, because it doesn't really look so much like that. It has a very different look.
Well, that's reassuring to know that they haven't sort of edged out the fantasy potential for yourself as a writer. But let's come to my neighbourhood, as it were, because you told me that you wrote the first draft of the first book in your series, The Lord of Stariel, while living in Oxford. So did you find the city itself as a source of inspiration? I mean, there's a lot of Oxford and Cambridge, I think, in your other city in your book. Well, one of your other cities called Knoxbridge.
Yes, cunningly disguised.
Cunningly, yes.
Yes, no one will ever guess. Yes, I wrote the first draft. I had just moved to Oxford. I'd moved to Oxford in October, and I think around 2014, and I was starting a new job in November, and I needed a way to meet people. So I thought, I'll write a novel for National Novel Writing Month, which is November, and so that's sort of where Stariel came from, and it was very influenced by living in England, by the kind of November is kind of the weather's getting kind of colder, so all the kind of like, particularly like the lamps and like that kind of old style architecture that there's so much of around there, and the beautiful buildings. And I'd also recently been up to done a little bit of travelling up in Scotland.
Hence the Lord from the North idea in the
yeah. Well, I'd been rewatching an old series from a little while ago called Monarch of the Glen. I don't know if you've heard of it.
Oh yes, yeah.
So which has as a sort of initial, it's sort of set in modern times, but the sort of the kickoff of the TV show is that the sort of black sheep of the family gets a call that his father's dead and goes back to the crumbling old estate in Scotland. And so I sort of had that in my head, and the sort of season of the turn of seasons. And I thought, but it would be much cooler if it was magical and set further ago, and if the main character was a woman.
I think AJ, this is great, because this is exactly the way that our sort of magpie tendency as writers should be used. Like, you watch something like Monarch of the Glen, which is entirely different
yes.
from your series, but you take the thing which sparks your imagination and turn that into your opener, because you've got your wonderful main character Heta, who was living a life of relative freedom down in the main city as a illusionist in the stage company, answering the call to go back to the ancestral home to find out which of her family, the Valstars, is that right?
Yes.
Is going to be picked as the next Lord of Stariel. So that takes us to the location of your story. Your series feels it has the feeling of a historical fantasy, but it doesn't have a specific location. It has at its heart a wonderful little wonderful concept of a little independent kingdom which has a foot in the Fey world and a foot in the human world. And that really is a character in the book in and of itself, in a very important way. You've begun to mention that some of your imagery, like the lamps and the old buildings, are taken from being there. But what was the thought process behind setting it in this familiar but undefined world, and then also the period that you pick, which sort of maps maybe onto the interwar period in the 20th century, possibly, but then you might have a different view?
I feel like my reasoning was not very deep and was largely driven by cool aesthetics, where I, things said in the past seem a bit cooler, but also I really like the idea of plumbing, so everyone can, wash. So I didn't want to go like so far back that it was sort of pre that kind of era, and
yeah, so one of the big things is they're running a telephone line in, and
I sort of like that idea of like everything's kind of a bit old-fashioned still, but they're just starting to get some modern technologies like electricity and phone lines and things. And I kind of wanted to do that sort of juxtaposition of where Het has come from, the sort of city down south, that the technology is kind of more entrenched and more developed, but it hasn't quite made it out as far as the kind of old estates that are still clinging on to the past and, don't, and are a little bit more magical, and where people are a little bit more superstitious. I very loosely used the kind of Edwardian time period, but I did play very fast and loose with historical accuracy. And I have to admit that that's sort of driven by my own lack of desire to do huge amounts of research. Like I like looking a little bit up, but I knew if I said it like in a very firm historical time period, then that would entail checking dates and what people had access to at particular times, and that would have been just a very different approach. Whereas I was more interested in kind of the aesthetics, really, and weaving the fantasy through that.
And people are sort of looking for parallels. I mean, the Susanna Clarke, Dr. Norrell and Mr. Strange, or Mr. Strange and Dr. Norrell, whichever way around that book is very specifically in a Napoleonic War era and linked to history, whereas her more recent book, Piranesi, is in more of a space that doesn't quite a timeless but old-fashioned place. And yours is more on that end of the spectrum than the I'm intervening.
Yeah, well, if you set it in our world in a specific period of history, then you kind of have to start. You have to start considering like how real world historical events would have unfolded, and I guess I was less interested in that. It's like it's an interesting path to take, but it's a different path. These sort of. And the reason why it's set in the past at all is because I really like the sort of those kind of old-fashioned social mores with the sort of heightened melodrama over what we would consider today very small stakes of like, you can't sort of break the social rules or people will, gossip about you and that sort of sort of propriety. Worrying about that kind of thing is just a lot of fun.
So there's two main characters who fall foul of that, because Het, as a unmarried woman, I'm not going to do any plot spoiling here, but she has what's thrown at her by the male lords is her femaleness and her fitness as a woman to rule, but also to conduct her life in a way that they do. But what she does, she gets censored for. And I love the way that your heroine is just so unapologetic. She's come from a world prior to that, which was much freer, this theatre world, and she just thinks they're all ridiculous. And I love the fact that so often her thoughts are, oh gosh, I'm pushing it. Just get over it kind of attitude. And then her older brother Marius, who is gay and struggling with those urges there in a way which hopefully now in many parts of the world that's no longer that would just be accepted. His is in a period when he has to hide that, and that adds an extra drama to his character. Talking about the sort of relationships and use of gender, I was really fascinated by the very natural use that you make of intersex characters in the Fey world. They just are, like Lamorkin.
Oh, non-binary characters.
Non-binary, yeah. Is that something which was influenced by the debates going on in the outer world, or did you just feel that was right for the, how did that emerge as a theme?
I guess I've always found gender really interesting, like to think about and play with, and I have a lot of non-binary friends, so it seemed perfectly natural to have some in the books. But I guess it was one of the things I wanted to do with the Fae culture was in sort of contrast to the sort of human culture that is still quite sexist and very binary about what, that there are only women and men, and that men and women have very particular kind of ideas of what they should and shouldn't be. I kind of wanted to contrast that with the Fae culture, which has its own issues, but one of the things that they're quite good at is that they don't think about gender in quite the same way. And so I sort of thought, well, if gender is sort of not an issue for them in the same way that it is for humans at this point in time, then it seems very natural that it would also be no big deal that there would naturally be non-binary and trans Fae, and that would just sort of, that they wouldn't even necessarily have a word for that, because it would just be as normal as any other kind of presentation.
I kind
of wanted it to just feel very not unusual.
Yeah, exactly. That was so relaxing, because it wasn't like a message novel. It was one where this is how the world is, and it was nice to go there in your imagination and think. It gives it sort of
one thing that I like, there would obviously have been non-binary people in terms of humans and this world as well, but the story sort of doesn't focus on them. And that would have been a bit harder to do, in terms of they would have been pushing against sort of societal rules, so the story would have had to be kind of more about that.
You already had a couple of issues going on, so maybe that as an extra issue would have been another main character, and it would it
was something I wanted to include, but I there's only so many things you can do in a book before it gets too long.
A lot of writing is about choices, isn't it? That's the so just thinking, I'm not sure I've done a good job of giving the flavor of it. I was thinking, well, what is it like? I felt it, for me, it felt really quite unique, but I suppose one story that came up to my mind was Cold Comfort Farm. I don't know if you know this story. It's a mid-20th century comedy novel, where a female character goes to a traditional household and shakes it up, and her presence there, it's in the real world, but a comic real world, similar period. It kind of revolutionizes the household. And how your first book starts, not the later ones, felt a bit like that moment where you've got this catalyst coming into a traditional world. The assumption is the lordship is going to pass to Jack, who's like the kind of steady hand, like close to being like the old lord. But it's, I don't think it's too much of a plot spoiler to say it doesn't happen like that.
The least surprising twist.
So it has that fun and that feeling of a revolution happening within a world that's got kind of a bit too close before you open out to the other worlds. But I should mention, of course, that it's also a love story, an interspecies love story. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Wynne Halloween, your wonderful butler come steward come prince?
Yes, which is also a plot spoiler, but it's fairly impossible to talk about the first book particularly without giving away bits that I don't think the first book, some things that are set up are relatively easy to see coming. I feel like that's probably one of them. And so there's sort of a twist that the main estate that's called Stariel turns out to be, in addition to being a human estate, it's also part of the fairy world, and the Fae have been absent from the world for several centuries for reasons that are later explained. But they've just sort of started coming back, and one of them has been present on the estate in the guise of pretending to be a human butler, and he's been sort of childhood friends with Heta, the main character, and then she went away to the city and sort of pursued her own life, and she's returned. And yes, they sort of have a growing relationship over the course of the 4 books.
And you don't want to spoil it too much.
So I'm like, how do we?
But I think one of the things I would say, AJ, that I really appreciated is that your plotting is excellent. So there were a couple of twists in the very first book, which one I thought, oh, I knew she was going to do that, and then you turn the tables again, and you think, oh, okay, she caught me out there. So I would really recommend people, if they want to read a really just a good story, it's there. But also your overarching plot, which I can't say too much about because that would be serious spoilers, but there is a release of information about why it all is as it is that comes gloriously to a head at the end of the 4th book. So I thought it was great. I really, really enjoyed that, the way you did that. So when you plot books out, are you somebody who, say, starts with a character and just explores, or a concept, or do you have like your post-it notes or your files in Scrivener or whatever with it all mapped out in advance?
I definitely don't plan it all in advance. I usually start with kind of something about the world and the setting and the character, and then a lot of it sort of comes from the character kind of saying, well, what would they do in this situation? If I throw this at them, what happens? How would they react? And then I sort of find out things as I go along. And then I do a huge amount of editing to make it look like I knew where I was going at the beginning and start. So I'm very gratified to hear that worked.
Yeah, that's one of the things I say to people I'm teaching on the creative writing courses we run, which is you may have written a scene where you mention in passing, I don't know, a box on a table or a thing on the wall. And then when you're thinking, oh, I need something, some foreshadowing of this thing. Oh, remember that box I put in that scene? And you go back and you make that the clue. But you didn't think of it at the time when you first put it in.
Yeah, that is one of the lovely things about writing, is when it feels like your brain kind of secretly set up a thing that you didn't know it was setting up until you get there, and then you're like, oh, that's why we put that thing in back then.
Yeah.
Which doesn't always happen perfectly, and usually you have to go back and kind of smooth it out a bit, but drop a few more hints or change something so that it's consistent. I have thought of another thing I wanted to say about the romance.
Oh, okay. Spill.
I'm allowed to go back. One of the things I did really want to do with the romance particularly was I wanted to do a slightly untraditional kind of relationship dynamic to what I'd read in a lot of books at the time that I was looking at, where I was reading a lot of romance books where the man was very like sort of in charge and commanding and sort of
had lots of mistresses like the Bridgerton boys.
Yeah, that's sort of like I guess the sort of classic sort of alpha male stereotype kind of thing. I wanted to do. I was like, what if the guy was really like, he's still confident, but what if he was more? What if he was more about like running the household? And with her, I wanted to make her kind of quite traditionally feminine in terms of, being interested in clothing and her appearance and stuff, whilst also being very kind of strong, but not in a way that was like punching people strong, but like, so that was sort of a gender dynamic thing I was interested in doing there.
Yeah, you didn't flip the roles. So it's
No,
not that she's become the alpha male and he's become the...
no.
It's more that they are individuals who aren't conforming to a particular prescribed role. So Heta, and this isn't a plot spoiler because very early on it's clear that she's had boyfriends and dated and had a sort of normal life before she comes back home so she has that experience behind her and confidence of not sort of being kept in the nursery really. And I think that's good because it gives her, she's mature. She's not the sort of simpering virgin type.
Not that I don't also like a good classic alpha male in romance or a simpering virgin. There's definitely a time and a place for both of those kind of character types can be enjoyed.
But not as Lord of Stariel. We need...
Yeah, it was just a thing I was interested in playing with. So I was like, I should say that.
I think that I won't say quite. Again, it's a plot spoiler to say too much, but I think you did that really well, and it doesn't feel. Basically, you believe in the magnetism and the sexual attraction between them, which could be the casualty here if it wasn't right. You feel that they get each other and they are the pull together based on this childhood friendship that's grown. It's very convincing and sweet and lovely. So yeah. I was looking when I got to the end of the last book. I read. That was the point at which I read your little biography about yourself, and you describe yourself as an independent writer. So, what's your journey to publishing been like? And have you got any tips for listeners wanting to follow in a similar path? Because you're a bit less scary because I think they can understand how your writing journey started. But I'm going to try a novel in November, and many people might be thinking that as well, but you've done the steps beyond that. Spill the beans on how that happened.
So before I wrote The Lord of Stariel, I tried to write other things that were more kind of epic fantasy style things, and I always kind of gotten lost in the boggy middle. And so I thought, with this one, I'm going to write like a short, simple, straightforward standalone, no epics, and it's never going to see the light of day, so it doesn't matter. So I can just have fun, just write something that's fun for me. And then obviously it is not a standalone and it is published. But that's sort of, so I originally had no intention to publish it. And then as it sort of grew and I ended up writing, I wrote drafts of all the books before I thought about publishing because I knew that I would need to know where the series was going. And so I am self-published. I probably should have said that at the start. So I'm self-published, and the reasons I chose that were many and several. There are definitely advantages to going independent, and there are advantages to going traditional. I decided that self-publishing to give it a go. I had some advantages in that I have a background in editing and in publishing. Like I've done typesetting and sort of production management. So I knew some bits of the process that I felt confident I could do to a good standard, and that was sort of my kind of commitment to myself. I was like, well, if I'm going to self-publish that, I want it to be sort of indistinguishable from a traditionally published book for the people reading it. I don't want it to feel like it hasn't had enough attention or enough polish. So it was quite a long process, and quite a lot of that was me leveling up a bit in my craft. So the first book particularly went through a lot of drafts. And
you had a whole crew of beta readers in your thanks at the back.
Yeah, and a lot of that was beta reading. So getting other people to read it and give me feedback, and then letting it sit for a bit and going back to it and that sort of thing.
How did you come up with your cover design, which is very strong?
So I was just going to say, like, one of the key things when you're self-publishing is getting your covers right, because your cover is your kind of single most important kind of marketing asset. So you want a cover that signals the genre really clearly. So you go and look at other books that are sort of similar to yours, which was a bit hard for me because at the time there wasn't that much that felt similar. So trying to figure out what my subgenre was and how best to signal that was a bit tricky, but I eventually came down on that kind of look because there were sort of a couple of books that were doing kind of that sort of style of kind of that kind of my covers are sort of illustrated but kind of in a very kind of cut out sort of look. And I found a designer I liked and she's turned out to be brilliant and has done all my covers. And I wanted them to sort of convey the kind of vibe of the book, that it was fantasy, it was sort of historical feeling, that it was whimsical. So I'm very pleased with my covers, and I think they have contributed hugely to the success I've had with that series. I think a lot of people took a chance on them because they saw the covers and were like, oh, what is that? So my advice for indie publishing would be, level up your craft as well as you can.
Be professional about it, I suppose.
Get a good cover that signals the genre, and do research on what you think your audience is likely to find appealing, kind of what they're looking for, and the same with the blurb, and find like a group of like-minded people to support you and bounce ideas off and give feedback. There's heaps of resources out there for indie authors now. Lots of Facebook groups and Discord servers and people on Twitter, and so find the group of those that works for you. And the other great thing about indie publishing is you can always change stuff because you have power, which you can set up a new pen name if the first one didn't work, or you can change the covers, or you can change the whole book if you look at it later and think, oh, actually I've improved so much since then and now I sort of don't want this up under my name.
I forgot, did you have a budget? Sorry, this is quite techie questions here, but I'm genuinely interested. Did you have a budget for promoting the book, or was it an organic growth through readers?
I did do a little bit of marketing, but not a huge amount in the beginning. I paid to list it on like a reviewing site, the first book, so to get it into the hands of like book bloggers and things. And I've run a few like sales promotions, but it was sort of very organic, slow build. Like it definitely wasn't a success straight out of the gate. It took time. Around when book 3 came out, which is general received indie wisdom, is there's something magical about 3, the number 3, like that when you have 3 books out in a series. I don't know, maybe readers think, oh, I believe that they're going to finish the series, or it helped once there was 3 books out, but a lot of it's been word of mouth. I've been very fortunate to get some really good reviews by various blogging sites and in places large and small that have all kind of helped as it's gone along the way, which has been really cool.
That's absolutely fascinating, because I think that's one of the areas where a lot of people are looking to see how do the secrets of success, and your organic word of mouth is still there, which is reassuring. You didn't.
Yeah, it really is. It's not going to give you. I mean, there are people that do go sort of viral overnight, but you don't have to go viral to find success, which is sort of reassuring. Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of attention to craft and making the kind of package look appealing of the kind of cover blurb content really helps you out, because that's going to get you the word of mouth. It also helps if what you've written appeals to people, and that's a harder thing to, I think, try and do purposefully. I think I was lucky in that I kind of wrote these books for me, and it turned out that what I wanted to read, there was other people that wanted to read it. But there's also like 6 billion people on Earth, so with indie publishing, you mostly sell ebooks, so you can kind of sell to people all over the world. So even if your audience is potentially quite small, you know that out of 6 million people, that's a lot of people. 7 million people. How many are up to now?
I actually came to your books because I consume a lot of audio versions of things, and I think it might even have been on one of the deals where it was, so that worked in one of your sales. But also because Finty Williams was reading, and she read my very first book. Finty Williams she probably gets annoyed by this, but she's Judy Dench's an actress over here. And so immediately I saw that name. I thought, that's going to be well read. So this is worth me trying. So first question, I suppose, to you is, what do you think of the audio adaptation? The last book is read by somebody else, isn't it? With a not dissimilar voice, so it's not jarring. And have you sort of thought about your listening audience and that impact on you? Because the received wisdom is that people don't get much back from commissioning an audio book, but maybe you've bucked that trend.
I have to take back my indie author claims, because my audiobooks are actually done by Podium. So I have a publisher who just does the audiobooks.
That's interesting. I've not heard that. Can you tell us more?
So they approached me. And were like, we would like to make audiobooks of your books. Here are our terms. What do you think? So I talked to them about it and decided that would be good, because I wanted to have them on audio, but it is, as you say, it's quite expensive to do it yourself if you're having to pay for someone to narrate them, and I wasn't sure whether I could justify putting the cost in. So I was happy to let them do it, and they have a good reputation as an audiobook publisher. And at the time, I hadn't really listened to many audiobooks. So I felt like I didn't really have the expertise to do it myself, to judge what was needed. Now I have listened to quite a lot of audiobooks. I've gotten really into them. But at the time, when they sent me the recordings, I was a bit uncertain. I was like, I don't know whether I'm going to be able to cope with hearing someone else read my book out loud. But I started listening to it, and then immediately was just entranced. I was like, oh my goodness, Finty has made this sound
quite good.
Yeah, sounds really good. How? Like, what kind of dark sorcery is this? Like I was like, I want to keep listening to find out what happens.
I remember that experience most on a book of mine, which I published a long while ago now, but it's called The Ship Between the Worlds. It's a middle grade fantasy about pirates in a fantasy setting. And I had 2 main pirate captains in it. And the actor who took on the part had decided to give one of them a really broad Glaswegian accent, which I hadn't written into the script or the book at all. And as soon as I heard it, I thought, well, obviously he has a Glaswegian accent. I mean, that was just waiting to be unlocked. And so he sort of, it's where you're no longer in control of your own book.
It was like getting to read alongside someone else and see how they were interpreting it as they were reading it, which was fascinating, because normally you only get to know what you yourself think as you read something. But yeah, that same thing of seeing how they do accents for different characters that you haven't specified, and being like, oh, okay. Oh, valid. I hadn't really imagined that, but yeah. So I I've really enjoyed Vinty's narration. I'm very pleased with it. And it's really nice to have audiobooks now that as I said, I listen to a lot more audiobooks generally because they're so convenient. You can listen to them while you're doing other things.
Exactly. That's why, for me, it's the driving in the car thing. That's what I listen to. So what next for AJ? You mentioned in your notes at the end of the fourth book that you might do a fifth. Is that happening?
Yes, so that is what I'm currently working on. It's sort of, I guess it's technically book 5 and that it does follow chronologically, even though book 4 is very definitely the conclusion of the series. It's done. But this book is about it's about a different character. It's about Hedda's brother, who is sort of becomes a more prominent side character over the 4 books, and then this book is sort of his book with him as the main character. And I'm trying to make it kind of self-contained and also kind of work potentially even if you haven't read the first 4 books, which we'll see if I manage to do that successfully. And it's a romance and also a murder mystery. Because I thought that would be a good way to stop the plot from accidentally turning into 4 books, which is what happened with The Lord of Stariel. And so that should hopefully, I'm hoping to get that out this year. It's underway at the moment.
Well, all the best with that. I look forward to reading it when it does come out. At the end of my podcast, I always ask my guest to choose a fantasy world in which it's the best to be something. So we've done all sorts of things from, the best place to go for a drink, like the best tavern, best place to be a warrior, loads of things. And I thought that picking up the wider theme of your book, which has this love story between people of different sort of species, if that you've had a thought where in all the fantasy worlds you've read or watched is a good place to be in love with somebody from a different race, species.
I had to think about this one for a while because I feel like the setup of most fantasy worlds is that there's usually tension between love with someone from a different species, and I decided that it would have to be like fantasy romance because that way you would definitely get a happy ending with the person you fell in love with, and I thought it would probably be a good idea for it to be like some kind of shifter romance, because then whoever you fell in love with, you'd also get the bonus of like their if you fell in love with a werewolf, you'd get kind of the sort of big extended family as well. So I have chosen Nalini Singh, who is a New Zealand author who writes kind of paranormal fantasy romance series. I feel like her worlds, even though a lot of bad things happen, like the romances always work out happily, and there's a lot of like extended family vibes. So I decided that would be the best.
Well, thank you for mentioning shifter romances because I hadn't thought of those. I was thinking, maybe something science fiction was what I was thinking.
I mean, it is, what is not science fiction, but it's speculative fiction.
Yeah. So I'm going to actually go. I've changed my pick. Hearing you, I like the Patricia Briggs Mercedes Thompson series, which is the Mercedes Thompson is a car mechanic, but also she is a Native American coyote shifter, and her relationship is with a more traditional werewolf shifter. So you've got and it's so funny. It's a brilliantly handled, as well as the serious plot. There's so much comedy in it, but the imagining these different species and how they can come together. She brings the hostility between coyotes and wolves into how Mercedes is accepted or not accepted in the pack, which adds a whole dimension to a love story. The Romeo and Juliet aspect without the tragic, ending. So we've gone werewolf. Excellent.
Werewolf, or I'm thinking of Nalini Singh's like Psy Changeling series where they have werewolves but also like people with psychic abilities.
Excellent.
Yeah.
This sounds good.
Yeah.
I haven't read these, and I
Oh,
thought
you should. They're
I've
excellent.
read almost all there was of the werewolf stories because I love a good shifter series.
Yeah, they're not all werewolves, but they're all animals that they change into. So
Absolutely, that sounds great. So thanks so much, AJ, for joining me today. And we'll put a link to your books in the show notes so people can find them. But just so if you've come to the end of this series, this episode, and you're thinking, I really want to go and read AJ's books now, you just need to look up AJ Lancaster, Lord of Stariel, and that will take you to the first book in the series. So thank you so much, AJ, and all the best with book 5.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.